Chapter 1. The Selection. Before the Inquisition claimed me, I was nobody special. Matthias Kaine, Administratum scribe 3rd class, stationed on the hive world of Korath Prime. My daily existence revolved around processing shipping manifests, population tallies, and tithe assessments in sub-level Gamma 7 of the planetary governance complex. The work was mind-numbing, but it was predictable. Safe, my cramped hab unit measured exactly 3 meters by 4, furnished with a regulation cot, a small desk, and a single pict viewer that rarely worked. I shared communal washing facilities with 47 other low-level bureaucrats. We lived our lives in neat little boxes, processing data for an Imperium so vast that our individual contributions meant nothing. The air recyclers hummed constantly, mixing the metallic tang of processed atmosphere with the perpetual smell of unwashed humanity. Every morning at 0500 hours, the work klaxons would sound, and we'd shuffle to our stations like servitors programmed for tedium. I'd always been good with numbers, blessed with an eidetic memory that made me valuable enough to avoid the labor gangs, but not important enough to advance beyond my current station. My supervisor, Proctor Valdis, was a corpulent man who measured success by the tonnage of paperwork processed daily. He'd patrol our section, his augmetic eye whirring as it recorded our productivity metrics. Efficiency through repetition, he'd wheeze, his respirator mask clicking with each breath. The Emperor's work demands precision. I'd been at my station for 8 years, 7 months, and 12 days when everything changed. The date was 247th M41, 3rd shift of Secundus morning. I was reviewing grain shipment records from the agricultural zones when the blast doors sealed without warning. The sudden grinding of metal on metal made everyone look up from their data slates. Emergency lumens bathed our section in red light. The voxcasters crackled to life with a voice I'd never heard before. Calm, measured, utterly without emotion. Section Gamma 7 is now under inquisitorial oversight. All personnel will remain at their stations. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance is heresy. Proctor Valdis tried to activate his communication array, but the systems had been locked down. His augmetic eye sparked and went dark. Someone with superior authority had overridden his implants remotely. He slumped in his chair, suddenly looking very small and very afraid. 3 figures entered through the blast doors. The first wore the black leather coat of an inquisitorial acolyte, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The second was clearly military. I recognized the carapace armor and hellgun of a stormtrooper. The third made my skin crawl, a servo skull floating at shoulder height, its empty eye sockets glowing with malevolent red light. "I am Interrogator Vex," the woman announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "By the authority of His Most Holy Inquisition, this facility is under investigation for heretical activity. You will cooperate fully, or you will be executed for obstruction." She moved between our workstations with predatory grace, her augmetic hand clicking against data slate screens as she examined our work. The servo skull followed, its sensors scanning each of us in turn. When it reached my station, it lingered, the mechanical whirring growing louder. "This one," it said in a voice like grinding gears. "Anomalous data patterns detected. Requires closer examination." Interrogator Vex approached my desk. Her eyes, one natural brown, one artificial blue, studying me with uncomfortable intensity. "Scribe Kaine, your records indicate exceptional memory retention and pattern recognition capabilities. You've also flagged 17 discrepancies in shipping manifests over the past year that your superiors chose to ignore." I'd indeed noticed irregularities, grain shipments that didn't match harvest reports, population figures that shifted inexplicably, tithe assessments that seemed deliberately miscalculated. But questioning the data wasn't my job. My job was to process and file. "Tell me about Manifest 7 Alpha 9947, she said, producing a data slate from her coat. Grain shipment from Agricultural Zone Septimus, dated 156.M41. My memory supplied the details instantly. Manifest claimed 14,000 tons of wheat, but the harvest report for that zone only recorded 9,000 tons total production. The discrepancy was flagged in my report, but Proctor Valdis classified it as clerical error. Valdis started to protest, but the stormtrooper's hellgun swiveled toward him and he fell silent. "Interesting," Vex said. "A Manifest 12 Beta 3301. Industrial components from Manufactorum District 5. Again, my memory provided perfect recall. Requested 300 Promethium condensers. Manifest showed delivery of 300 units, but the weight specifications were wrong. Each condenser should weigh exactly 247 kilograms. The delivered units weighed 312 kilograms each. The servo skull's optical sensors flared brighter. Probability of concealed contraband, 94.7%. Subject demonstrates exceptional observational capabilities." Interrogator Vex smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Scribe Kaine, you've been unknowingly documenting a smuggling operation that has been funneling weapons to heretical cults across 3 sectors. Your attention to detail has provided us with evidence that will result in the execution of 47 traitors." She leaned closer, and I could smell the ozone scent of her augmetics. "The Inquisition has need of minds like yours. You can continue your insignificant existence here, processing data until you die of old age and tedium. Or you can serve the Emperor in ways that actually matter." It wasn't really a choice. People who declined inquisitorial recruitment rarely lived long enough to regret the decision. "I'll serve," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Excellent. Gather your personal effects. Your old life ends now." As I collected my few possessions, a worn copy of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, a small Aquila pendant my mother had given me, and a spare set of robes, I heard Proctor Valdis pleading for leniency. The servo skull had identified him as complicit in the smuggling operation. The last thing I saw as we left Section Gamma 7 was Valdis being fitted with neural inhibitor shackles. His augmetic eye had been replaced with a blinking red light that marked him as a condemned heretic awaiting execution. The blast doors sealed behind us with a finality that echoed in my bones. After 8 years of predictable tedium, I was about to discover what it truly meant to serve the Emperor's will. Chapter 2. First Lessons. The inquisitorial transport that carried me away from Korath Prime was unlike any vessel I'd ever seen. Where Imperial Navy ships were functional and austere, this craft radiated menace from every surface. Gargoyles carved from blackened steel leered from the bulkheads, their eyes replaced with purity seals that fluttered in the recycled air. The corridors were deliberately narrow, designed to make occupants feel trapped and watched. Interrogator Vex led me through a maze of passages to a sparse cabin that would serve as my quarters. A single cot, a small desk, and a shrine to the Emperor dominated the cramped space. The walls were lined with texts I'd never seen before. Treatises on detecting heretical behavior, guides to identifying Xeno's corruption, and manuals for enhanced interrogation techniques. "Your education begins immediately," Vex informed me, activating a holo display that filled the cabin with ghostly images. "The Inquisition operates on principles that civilian institutions cannot comprehend. We do not seek evidence to build cases. We seek truth to preserve humanity's soul." The first lesson involved case studies of heretical corruption. I watched in growing horror as the holodisplay showed entire planetary populations consumed by chaos cults. Their flesh twisted into obscene forms that violated every natural law. The images were clinical in their presentation, but the implications made my stomach turn. Subject 7 Gamma was a merchant prince on Balthazar III, Vex narrated, as the display showed a man whose skin had become translucent, revealing organs that pulsed with unnatural colors. He began experiencing prophetic dreams after acquiring an ancient artifact from the Hadron system. Within 6 months, he had converted his entire household to chaos worship. Within a year, the planet's population had decreased by 40%. I tried to maintain composure, but my hands were shaking. What happened to the survivors? There were no survivors. The planet was subjected to exterminatus. 2 billion souls cleansed by fire to prevent the corruption from spreading. The casual way she described genocide made me understand the scope of what I'd committed myself to. This wasn't bureaucracy with higher stakes. This was war against threats that could damn entire worlds. The second lesson focused on identifying signs of corruption. Vex taught me to recognize micro-expressions that indicated deception, speech patterns that suggested psychological compromise, and behavioral anomalies that might indicate possession or mutation. The training was exhaustive and exhausting. "Observe," she said, displaying footage of an Imperial Guard officer giving orders to his men. Notice the slight tremor in his left hand at 0047. The way his eyes tracked to the upper right when discussing casualties. The barely perceptible hesitation before saying, "For the Emperor." These are indicators of potential corruption. I studied the footage for hours, learning to see patterns that had been invisible to my untrained eye. The officer in question had been executed after his regiment was discovered worshipping a demon prince they believed to be a saint. The third lesson was practical application. Vex brought me to an interrogation chamber deep in the ship's hull, where a prisoner waited in neural shackles. The man was clearly a merchant. His expensive robes and soft hands marked him as someone accustomed to comfort. Trader Kylos was arrested on suspicion of trafficking in xenotech, Vex explained. Imperial Customs found suspicious energy signatures in his cargo hold, but no contraband was discovered. Your task is to determine whether he's innocent or guilty. The interrogation room smelled of fear sweat and ozone from the neural shackles. Kylos looked up at me with desperate eyes, clearly hoping that a fellow civilian might show more mercy than his inquisitorial captors. "Please," he whispered, "I've done nothing wrong. I'm a loyal servant of the Emperor." I began with basic questions about his trade routes and cargo manifests. His answers were consistent and detailed, but something felt off. The way he described his stops in the Hadron system, the same region where the artifact from the first case study had originated, triggered my pattern recognition training. "Tell me about your last shipment from Hadron Prime," I said. "Standard agricultural products. Grains, preserved fruits, nothing unusual." But his micro-expressions told a different story. The slight widening of his pupils when I mentioned Hadron Prime, the way his breathing changed when discussing agricultural products, the barely perceptible twitch in his jaw when he said nothing unusual. I spent 3 hours questioning him, using techniques Vex had taught me. Gradually, the truth emerged. Kylos had been smuggling xenotech artifacts hidden inside modified grain containers. The technology was Tau in origin, potentially valuable, but absolutely heretical by Imperial law. "How many artifacts?" I asked. 17 over the past 2 years, he admitted, his resolve finally cracking. "But I was going to turn them over to the Mechanicus for study. I wasn't selling them to heretics." Vex, who had been observing silently, stepped forward. "The penalty for xenotech trafficking is death. Your intentions are irrelevant." Kylos began to weep, but I felt nothing but satisfaction. The training was working. I could see through lies and deception to find the truth that protected humanity from its enemies. The fourth lesson came that evening in the ship's chapel. The space was deliberately intimidating, filled with skulls and symbols of imperial justice. Servo skulls floated between the pews, their optical sensors recording everything for later review. "Doubt is the beginning of heresy," Vex told me as we knelt before the altar. "You will encounter horrors that challenge your faith in the Emperor and the righteousness of our cause. You will see things that make you question whether our methods are just. This is the moment when most acolytes fall to corruption." She produced a small vial of crimson liquid from her coat. "This is blood from a martyred saint, blessed by the ecclesiarchy and sanctified through prayer. Drink it and let it remind you that doubt leads only to damnation." The liquid tasted metallic and bitter, but I drained the vial without hesitation. Whether it was truly saint's blood or simply wine mixed with stimulants didn't matter. What mattered was the commitment the ritual represented. "Your old identity is gone," she continued. Matthias Kaine the scribe died when you entered our service. You are now Acolyte Kaine of the Holy Inquisition. Your thoughts belong to the Emperor. Your actions serve the Imperium. Your soul is forfeit to duty. The words should have frightened me, but instead I felt a strange sense of purpose. For the first time in my life, I was part of something greater than processing data and filing reports. The transport journey lasted 8 days. By the end, I had absorbed enough knowledge to begin real fieldwork. I could identify 17 types of heretical corruption, operate basic interrogation equipment, and recite the articles of faith without error. More importantly, I had learned to see the universe as the Inquisition saw it, a battleground where humanity's survival depended on constant vigilance against corruption. On the final day, Vex brought me to the observation deck to see our destination, Throne World Station, an ancient fortress that served as an inquisitorial stronghold in the Ultima Segmentum. The station was massive, its Gothic spires and weapon batteries dwarfing even Imperial Navy battleships. "This will be your home for the next phase of training," she said. "Here you will learn the true scope of the threats we face. Here you will discover whether you have the strength to serve as an instrument of the Emperor's justice." As we approached the docking bay, I saw other transports arriving from across the sector. Each brought new recruits like myself, former civilians whose old lives had ended the moment the Inquisition noticed their potential. Some would thrive in their new roles. Others would break under the pressure of absolute duty. A few might even fall to the corruption they were trained to fight. But all of us had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I was no longer a scribe who processed data. I was an acolyte of the Holy Inquisition, and my real education was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Deeper Truth. Throne World Station existed in a state of perpetual tension that I could feel the moment I stepped off the transport. The corridors hummed with barely contained energy from psychic wards etched into every surface. Servo skulls drifted through the halls like mechanical vultures, their sensors constantly recording and analyzing every interaction. The air itself felt heavy with secrets and surveillance. My assigned cell was identical to the transport quarters, sparse, functional, designed to prevent comfort or complacency. The only decoration was a skull mounted above the desk, its empty sockets fitted with microvid recorders that tracked my every movement. Privacy was a concept that died with civilian life. Interrogator Vex delivered me to Training Complex Epsilon, where I joined 47 other new acolytes. We came from every corner of the Imperium, former arbitrators, ex-guard officers, defrocked priests, and displaced bureaucrats like myself. What united us was the same hollow look in our eyes, the expression of people who had glimpsed the abyss and chosen to serve it rather than be consumed by it. Our instructor was Inquisitor Mordian Thrace, a man whose augmetic replacements outnumbered his original limbs. His face was a patchwork of scars and mechanical components, dominated by optical implants that could see across multiple spectrums. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had executed entire populations in the Emperor's name. "You believe you serve the light," he began, pacing before our formation with mechanical precision. "You think the Inquisition stands as humanity's guardian against corruption and heresy. These are comforting lies we tell civilians to maintain order." The training hall fell silent, except for the humming of life support systems and the occasional click of recording servo skulls. The truth is more complex. We are not guardians. We are necessary monsters. We commit horrors to prevent greater horrors. We damn ourselves so that humanity might survive another day. Some of you will break under this knowledge. Those who break will be recycled into servitor components. Those who endure will become instruments of terrible purpose. He gestured to a massive holo display that filled the chamber with images of human suffering on an unimaginable scale. Planets burned from orbit, cities consumed by chaos corruption, entire populations executed for crimes they didn't understand they had committed. Case Study 1. The Vaxillian Incident, an agricultural world of 6 billion souls. The planetary governor reported unusual crop yields, 30% above projections for 17 consecutive seasons. Investigation revealed that the improvement stemmed from chaos corruption in the soil itself. The very ground had been blessed by the dark gods, making it impossibly fertile. The images showed vast fields of grain that writhed like living things, their stalks pulsing with veins of corrupted energy. Workers tended the crops with expressions of mindless bliss, their skin taking on the sickly pallor of Nurgle's touch. The corruption was subtle. Initial exposure caused no immediate symptoms, but after 5 years of consuming the tainted grain, the population began manifesting mutations. After 10 years, they worshipped the corruption as a gift from their generous father. After 15 years, they were no longer recognizably human. I watched in growing horror as the display showed the planet's final state. The humans had become writhing masses of flesh and plant matter, their consciousness absorbed into a collective organism that pulsed with demonic intelligence. The Exterminatus order was given by Inquisitor Valerius himself. 6 billion souls burned to prevent the corruption from spreading to neighboring systems. The grain had already been shipped to 47 worlds. Each shipment required follow-up sterilization. An acolyte to my left, a former arbitrator named Castiel, raised his hand. How many additional worlds were cleansed? 47, Thrace replied without emotion. The total death count was approximately 80 billion souls. This is what we do to protect humanity from corruption it cannot even recognize. The weight of those numbers settled over the chamber like a funeral shroud. 80 billion people executed to prevent a threat they didn't know existed. The mathematics of survival on a galactic scale. Case Study 2. The Astropath Conspiracy of Macarius Prime. A single corrupted astropath managed to influence 47 of his colleagues over the course of 6 months. The corruption manifested as enhanced psychic abilities and visions of a golden future for humanity under new leadership. The hollow display showed the Imperial Palace on Macarius Prime, its spires twisting into impossible geometries as reality warped around the corrupted psykers. The astropaths had begun rewriting their transmitted messages, subtly altering communications across an entire sector to promote rebellion against Imperial authority. The corruption was discovered when routine cogitator analysis detected statistical anomalies in message traffic. 7 words appeared 14% more frequently than baseline metrics predicted. Those 7 words were enough to identify a conspiracy that would have sparked civil war across 40 systems. I found myself analyzing the data as Thrace spoke, my training from the transport taking over. Pattern recognition was becoming instinctive. The subtle changes in language that indicated psychological manipulation. The micro-deviations from normal protocols that suggested external influence. The solution required executing not only the corrupted astropaths, but also every person who had received their communications. We could not determine the extent of the corruption spread through their networks. 800,000 Imperial servants died to prevent sector-wide rebellion. Another acolyte, a former scribe like myself, spoke up. How do we know the executions were necessary? Couldn't we have tested for corruption? Thrace's optical implants focused on the questioner with predatory intensity. Testing requires time. Time allows corruption to spread. We do not have the luxury of certainty, only the burden of decision. Better to execute the innocent than risk the salvation of humanity itself. The brutal logic was undeniable, but it felt like swallowing broken glass. This was the reality of service to the Inquisition, making choices that damned your soul to save everyone else's. Case Study 3. The Calixis Hive Incident. A seemingly routine investigation of gang warfare in an underhive settlement revealed something far worse. The gangs were not fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting to determine which chaos god would claim their souls. The display showed the nightmare landscape of Hive Calixis's lowest levels. 4 distinct territories, each twisted by the influence of different dark powers. The Khorne-influenced zone was carpeted with skulls and flowing blood. The Nurgle territory had become a festering swamp of disease and decay. The Slaanesh area pulsed with corrupted pleasure palaces, where humanity's darkest desires were given flesh. The Tzeentch quarter shifted constantly, its very geography changing according to incomprehensible schemes. The corruption had existed for 3 generations. Approximately 40 million souls called the Underhive home. All of them were irreversibly tainted by exposure to chaos influence. The only solution was to seal every entrance and fill the entire level with promethium fire. I could smell the burning flesh through the memory links in the display. 40 million people burned alive in their homes because they had been born in the wrong place at the wrong time. "You are beginning to understand," Thrace observed, noting our expressions. "The Inquisition exists because someone must make the impossible choices. Someone must bear the weight of necessary atrocities. We are damned so that humanity might remain pure." Training continued for 47 days. Each lesson revealed new layers of moral complexity that tested our resolve. We learned to operate mind probes that could extract confessions at the cost of the subject's sanity. We practiced enhanced interrogation techniques that violated every principle of human dignity. We studied the 17 approved methods for executing suspected heretics, each designed to maximize suffering as a deterrent to others. The psychological pressure was immense. 3 acolytes suffered complete nervous breakdowns and were led away by medici servitors. 5 more requested transfer to regular Imperial service and were informed that such transfers required lobotomization to ensure they could never reveal what they had learned. 2 actually chose that fate rather than continue their training. But for those who endured, something profound occurred. The constant exposure to moral horror created a form of psychological scarring that made further horrors bearable. We developed what Thrace called duty numbness, the ability to commit atrocities without emotional response, because the alternative was paralysis in the face of necessary action. On the final day of basic training, we were brought to Execution Chamber Prime to witness our first live termination. The subject was one of our former classmates, Acolyte Marcus, who had been discovered maintaining correspondence with family members on his homeworld. Contact with civilian attachments was strictly forbidden, as emotional connections could be exploited by chaos forces. Marcus knelt before the execution altar, his hands bound with neural shackles that prevented any final resistance. Inquisitor Thrace stood beside him, bolt pistol ready for the prescribed execution method. Acolyte Marcus violated security protocols by maintaining emotional attachments to civilian personnel, Thrace announced. Such weakness creates vulnerabilities that enemies of mankind can exploit. The penalty is death. Marcus looked directly at me as Thrace raised the bolt pistol. There were tears in his eyes, but no anger, only acceptance of his fate. He had been trained well enough to understand why his death was necessary. The bolt shell punched through his skull with a wet crack, spraying brain matter across the altar. Servo skulls immediately moved in to collect biological samples for analysis, ensuring that no trace of corruption had influenced his final moments. "This is what loyalty to the Inquisition demands," Thrace said, holstering his weapon. "Absolute devotion to duty, regardless of personal cost. You have seen what happens to those who retain civilian weaknesses. Choose your path accordingly." As we filed out of the execution chamber, I realized that my transformation was complete. The scribe who had processed shipping manifests was truly dead. In his place stood something harder and colder, an instrument of the Emperor's will, shaped by necessity into a weapon against humanity's enemies. The Inquisition had not recruited me to serve justice or protect the innocent. They had recruited me to make the choices that would damn my soul so that others could sleep safely in their ignorance. And I was grateful for the privilege. Chapter 4. Trial by Fire. My first field assignment came 3 months after completing basic training. Inquisitor Thrace summoned me to his private chambers, a stark room dominated by a desk carved from a single block of obsidian. The walls were lined with trophies from his 3 decades of service, demon weapons sealed in containment fields, the preserved heads of heretical cult leaders, and purity seals written in the blood of martyrs. "Acolyte Kaine," he said without preamble. You will accompany Interrogator Vex to the mining world of Corvin's Rest. Industrial output has decreased by 17% over the past 6 months, despite no reported equipment failures or workforce reductions. The Administratum suspects sabotage, but our astropaths have detected psychic disturbances consistent with chaos corruption. He slid a data slate across the obsidian surface. The mission briefing was extensive: population statistics, industrial capacity reports, geological surveys, and personnel files for key figures in the planetary hierarchy. My eidetic memory absorbed every detail as I scrolled through the information. Corvin's Rest was a typical Imperial mining world: harsh environment, expendable population, and resources essential to the war machine. 3 billion souls labored in the asteroid mining facilities, extracting promethium and rare metals for shipment across the sector. The work was dangerous and the mortality rate was high, but that was standard for such operations. Your specific assignment, Thrace continued, is to analyze productivity data for signs of organized resistance. Your background in data processing makes you uniquely qualified to identify patterns that might escape notice. Interrogator Vex will handle the more direct aspects of the investigation. The transport to Corvin's Rest took 4 days through the warp. During the journey, Vex briefed me on enhanced investigation protocols and provided additional equipment: a modified Auspex scanner capable of detecting psychic emanations, a neural probe for field interrogations, and a compact bolt pistol that felt alien in my civilian hands. "Remember," she emphasized as we prepared for planetfall, "we are not here to gather evidence for trial. We are here to identify and eliminate threats to Imperial security. Subtlety is useful only as long as it serves that primary objective." Corvin's Rest was even more unforgiving than the data had suggested. The surface was a wasteland of toxic storms and acidic precipitation, forcing the entire population to live in underground complexes, connected to the asteroid mining platforms by massive transport tubes. The air tasted of chemical processing and human desperation. Governor Malos met us at the primary landing facility, a nervous man whose augmetic legs suggested he had once worked the mines himself before rising to administrative authority. His deference to our inquisitorial rosettes was immediate and complete. "Holy Inquisition," he stammered, "I assure you that any production shortfalls are temporary. We have experienced some minor equipment malfunctions, but nothing that suggests sabotage or heretical activity." Vex's response was coldly professional. "Governor Malos, you will provide us with complete access to all facilities, personnel records, and industrial data. Any attempt to restrict our investigation will be considered obstruction of inquisitorial authority." The first 3 days of investigation revealed nothing obvious. Production logs showed the reported 17% decrease, but the explanations seemed legitimate: equipment failures, workforce accidents, and supply delays that were common on frontier worlds. I spent hours analyzing the data streams, looking for the patterns that had made me valuable to the Inquisition. The breakthrough came when I cross-referenced worker productivity reports with Medicaid treatment logs. Injuries were up 43% over the baseline period, but the types of injuries followed an unusual pattern. Traditional mining accidents, crushing injuries, burns from industrial equipment, respiratory damage from toxic exposure, had actually decreased. What had increased were psychological trauma cases, self-inflicted wounds, and injuries consistent with interpersonal violence. "The workers are fighting each other," I reported to Vex during our evening briefing. "But it's not random violence. The incidents cluster around specific work shifts and mining platforms. Platform 7 Alpha shows the highest concentration of unusual injuries." We visited Platform 7 Alpha the next morning, traveling through the transport tubes that connected the underground complexes to the mining platforms. The platform was a massive structure anchored to a particularly rich asteroid. Its industrial complexity designed to extract maximum resources with minimal regard for worker safety. The platform supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Corman, greeted us with the typical mixture of fear and resentment that inquisitorial investigators inspired. His scarred face and missing left arm marked him as someone who had survived decades in the mines through luck and ruthlessness. Platform 7 Alpha is my most productive facility, he insisted as we toured the extraction chambers. My crews work longer shifts and extract higher yields than any other platform in the system. The claim was accurate according to the data, but something felt wrong. The workers moved with mechanical precision that seemed unnatural, their faces displaying an empty contentment that reminded me of the corrupted agricultural workers from Inquisitor Thrace's training sessions. I activated the psychic scanner Vex had given me, sweeping it across the mining chambers while pretending to examine production equipment. The readings were immediately alarming. Psychic emanations were 17 times higher than baseline measurements, suggesting the presence of either powerful psychers or warp-touched artifacts. Interrogator Vex, I whispered into my microvox. I'm detecting significant psychic activity. The source appears to be in the lower extraction chambers. We descended to the deepest levels of Platform 7 Alpha, where the mining crews worked in near-complete darkness. The only illumination came from the plasma cutters used to slice through asteroid rock, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on the mind. The psychic emanations grew stronger as we descended, and I began to understand what we were facing. The workers weren't fighting because of poor conditions or labor disputes. They were fighting because something was compelling them to violence, feeding on their aggression and pain. In the lowest chamber, we found the source. Hidden behind a wall of processed ore was a cavity that had been deliberately concealed. Inside the cavity was an object that violated every natural law I understood. A crystalline structure that pulsed with internal light. Its surface inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Chaos artifact, Vex breathed, her hand moving instinctively to her bolt pistol. Probably Cornate, judging by the aggression-inducing effects. Supervisor Corman had followed us down, and his expression confirmed our suspicions. The empty contentment was gone, replaced by the fanatical devotion of someone who had gazed into the abyss and found it beautiful. You cannot understand, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested demonic influence. The blood god offers purpose beyond the Emperor's lies. These workers labor not for distant masters, but to feed the eternal war that gives meaning to existence. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Corman had discovered the artifact during routine mining operations and had been corrupted by exposure to its influence. Over months, he had systematically exposed his workers to its effects, turning them into unwitting servants of Khorne. The decreased productivity wasn't due to sabotage. It was because the workers were spending increasing amounts of time engaged in ritual combat to honor their new god. How many know? Vex demanded, her bolt pistol trained on Corman's chest. All of them, he replied with pride. 7,000 souls have felt the blood god's touch. They fight and die and kill with joy, knowing that their violence feeds something greater than imperial bureaucracy. 7,000 corrupted souls on a single platform. The investigation had uncovered not just heresy, but a full-scale chaos infestation that threatened the entire mining operation. Standard protocol required immediate termination of all infected personnel, but the scale was staggering. Contact the transport, Vex ordered. Request immediate evacuation for all Imperial personnel not assigned to Platform 7 Alpha. Prepare for orbital bombardment of the entire facility. But Corman was no longer listening to our conversation. The artifact behind him pulsed brighter, and I could feel something vast and hungry pressing against the barriers of reality. The workers throughout the platform had stopped their mining activities and were converging on our location, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of shared consciousness. The blood god calls, Corman whispered, and his body began to change. His remaining arms swelled with muscle that burst through his work coveralls. His missing limb regenerated as a mass of writhing tentacles tipped with bone spikes. His eyes became pools of molten brass that reflected no light. Vex's bolt pistol barked 3 times, punching explosive shells through Corman's torso. But the demon-possessed supervisor continued advancing, his wounds sealing themselves with every step. The first wave of corrupted workers reached our position, wielding mining tools that had been twisted into crude weapons. Plasma cutters had become flame-spewing brands. Ore haulers had grown serrated edges and barbed chains. Even the standard mining picks had been blessed with Kornati runes that made them supernaturally sharp. I drew my bolt pistol with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. The training had prepared me for this moment, not just the weapon drills, but the psychological conditioning that allowed me to see corrupted humans as targets rather than victims. The first shot took down a worker whose skull had been decorated with brass studs in honor of the blood god. The bolt shell exploded inside his cranium, spraying corrupted brain matter across the chamber walls. The second shot punched through a woman whose arms had been replaced with spinning saw blades. She collapsed in a spray of oil and blood, but there were too many of them, and they felt no pain or fear. They pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades, driven by demonic hunger that cared nothing for individual survival. "The artifact!" Vex shouted over the sound of gunfire. "Destroy the artifact!" I turned my attention to the crystalline structure while she held off the advancing horde with precise bolt pistol shots. The psychic emanations were so strong, they made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Looking directly at the artifact felt like staring into a furnace of pure malevolence. My scanner indicated that conventional weapons would be ineffective against the warp-touched crystal, but the training had covered this scenario. Chaos artifacts could be disrupted by overwhelming them with contradictory psychic energy. I activated the neural probe device, reversing its polarity to broadcast imperial prayers and litanies of purity. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The artifact began to crack, its internal light flickering like a dying star. The possessed workers stumbled as the demonic influence wavered. Corman's transformed body convulsed as the entities controlling it lost coherence, but destroying the artifact had consequences I hadn't anticipated. Without the demons controlling influence, the 7,000 corrupted workers throughout Platform 7 Alpha simultaneously experienced total psychic feedback. The screaming began immediately, not just audible screams, but psychic howls of agony that resonated through the warp itself. "Psychic cascade," Vex observed clinically as we fought our way toward the transport tubes. "The entire platform population is dying simultaneously. Their corrupted souls are creating a warp breach." The platform structure began to shake as reality warped around the dying masses. Bulkheads twisted into impossible geometries. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably. The very air began to taste of copper and ozone as the boundary between the Materium and Immaterium weakened. We reached the transport tubes just as the structural integrity alerts began sounding throughout the facility. Behind us, Platform 7 Alpha was consuming itself in a cascade of psychic energy that threatened to tear a permanent hole in reality. The transport tube journey back to the main complex took 17 minutes that felt like hours. Through the reinforced viewports, I watched Platform 7 Alpha tear itself apart as 7,000 souls died in synchronized agony. The industrial facility that had housed them twisted into abstract art before finally collapsing into the asteroid it had been anchored to. Governor Malos met us at the transport terminal, his face pale with terror. "What happened? The psychic readings are off the charts. Our astropaths are reporting warp disturbances across the entire system. Platform 7 Alpha has been cleansed of chaos corruption," Vex reported with bureaucratic precision. 7,000 heretical souls have been terminated. The threat to Imperial security has been eliminated." The governor's legs, both augmetic and organic, gave way, and he collapsed onto the platform floor. I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "Industrial capacity can be rebuilt. Souls claimed by chaos are lost forever." It was true, of course. The mathematics of galactic warfare made individual lives meaningless compared to the larger strategic picture. 7,000 corrupted workers would have eventually spread their taint across the entire system. Their deaths prevented millions of future casualties. But as we waited for the orbital transport to carry us back to Throne World Station, I found myself thinking about the workers who had died screaming in psychic agony. They had been corrupted through no fault of their own, victims of circumstance who had been in the wrong place when Corman discovered his artifact. Their deaths were necessary, but that necessity didn't make them less tragic. Second thoughts? Vex asked, observing my expression. No, I replied, and realized I meant it. Just understanding the weight of what we carry. She nodded approvingly. That understanding is what separates us from the fanatics who serve other imperial institutions. We know exactly what we do and why it must be done. That knowledge is both our burden and our strength. The return journey to Throneworld Station gave me time to compile my after-action report. The data analysis had been successful. I had identified the source of the industrial problems and provided tactical intelligence that allowed for effective resolution. The investigation had uncovered and eliminated a significant chaos infestation before it could spread beyond a single facility. By any measurable standard, the mission had been a complete success. The threat to Imperial security had been neutralized with minimal risk to Inquisitorial personnel. The broader mining operation could continue with replacement workers shipped in from other systems. But success in service to the Inquisition carried a price that was measured in more than just lives lost. It was measured in the gradual erosion of everything that had once made me human. The scribe who had worried about shipping manifest discrepancies would have been horrified by what I had become. The acolyte who had just overseen the deaths of 7,000 souls felt only professional satisfaction. Chapter 5. The Choice. 2 years passed before I fully understood what the Inquisition had made me. During that time, I served on 17 different investigations across 4 sectors, witnessing horrors that would have shattered my civilian mind, but which I now processed with clinical detachment. I had overseen the execution of suspected heretics, analyzed data that led to the sterilization of corrupted populations, and learned to sleep peacefully despite the screaming faces that haunted my dreams. The mission that changed everything began on the industrial world of Vaxhaven Prime, where reports of worker unrest had reached alarming proportions. Unlike the chaos corruption we had faced on Corvin's Rest, this seemed to be simple civil disobedience, striking workers, damaged equipment, and reduced productivity that threatened the sector's ammunition supply chain. Inquisitor Thrace assigned me to work alone for the first time, a sign of confidence that should have filled me with pride. This appears to be a routine investigation, he informed me during the briefing. Local arbitrators suspect agitator influence, possibly organized by off-world criminal syndicates. Your task is to identify the leadership structure and provide targeting data for mass arrests. Vaxhaven Prime was different from the mining worlds I had grown accustomed to. The factories were ancient but well maintained, their Gothic architecture suggesting centuries of continuous operation. The worker housing districts were cramped but clean, with evidence of community organization that spoke to generations of stable employment. My first stop was the Planetary Administration Complex, where Governor Castell provided access to production records and worker databases. The data showed a clear pattern. Productivity had declined by 12% over 6 months, with the decrease concentrated in specific manufacturing districts where worker organization was strongest. It began with demands for improved safety protocols, Governor Castell explained as we reviewed the reports. The workers claimed that new production quotas were causing excessive casualties. When their petitions were ignored, they began engaging in work slowdowns and equipment sabotage. The casualty reports supported the workers' claims. Industrial accidents had increased by 37% since the new quotas were implemented, with deaths rising from an average of 12 per month to 43. The increases were concentrated in ammunition manufacturing, where pressure to meet military demand had led to corner-cutting on safety procedures. I interviewed several arrested strike leaders, using the interrogation techniques that had become second nature. But instead of the fanatical devotion or corrupted consciousness I had learned to recognize, I found ordinary people driven to desperation by impossible working conditions. Marcus Dawn, leader of Manufacturing District 7, was a man in his 50s whose hands bore the scars of 3 decades working industrial machinery. His personnel file showed exemplary service, no disciplinary actions, consistent productivity ratings, and commendations for training new workers. "We're not rebels," he insisted during our interview. We're loyal servants of the Emperor who want to live long enough to see our children grow up. The new quotas require us to bypass safety protocols that exist for good reasons. I pressed him for evidence of off-world agitation or criminal influence, but his answers remained consistent. The strikes had developed organically as workers realized that their increased casualty rates were being treated as acceptable losses by the administration. "Show me the safety protocols," I demanded. Dawn provided documentation that painted a clear picture. The original manufacturing procedures included multiple redundancy checks, mandatory equipment maintenance schedules, and worker rotation policies designed to prevent exhaustion-related accidents. The new quotas made it impossible to follow these procedures while meeting production targets. "We're asked to choose between our lives and our loyalty to the Imperium," Dawn said, "but dead workers can't serve the Emperor. Maimed workers can't operate the machinery. The quotas are self-defeating." The mathematics supported his argument. While short-term production had increased, the rising casualty rates were creating an experience drain that would soon result in lower overall output. The administration was sacrificing long-term productivity for quarterly reports that looked good to distant bureaucrats. I spent the next week conducting similar interviews with other arrested leaders. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Ordinary workers driven to collective action by working conditions that prioritized production statistics over human lives. None showed signs of chaos, corruption, or criminal manipulation. They were simply people trying to survive in an industrial system that treated them as expendable resources. The evidence should have supported a recommendation for negotiated settlement. The workers' demands were reasonable, their methods were non-violent, and meeting their safety requirements would actually improve long-term productivity. A rational analysis suggested that minor reforms would resolve the situation without compromising imperial security. But I had not been sent to conduct rational analysis. I had been sent to identify targets for mass arrest. Governor Castell made the administration's position clear during our final meeting. The Departamento Munitorum has made it clear that production quotas are non-negotiable. Military operations across 3 sectors depend on our ammunition output. Any reduction in productivity threatens the war effort. The workers are requesting safety measures that would improve long-term output, I pointed out. "Long-term projections are irrelevant if we lose the current campaign," he replied. "The Astra Militarum needs ammunition now, not theoretical future production improvements." The brutal logic was familiar from my inquisitorial training. Short-term necessity trumped long-term sustainability. Military requirements override civilian welfare. The individual was meaningless compared to imperial strategic objectives. I transmitted my preliminary report to Inquisitor Thrace, documenting the strike leadership structure and providing the targeting data he had requested. Within hours, I received authorization for mass arrests that would decapitate the worker organization and allow production to resume at the demanded quotas. The arrest operation was scheduled for dawn the following day. Arbites units would simultaneously raid 47 locations, detaining anyone identified as a strike leader or agitator. The detained workers would be transported to penal colonies, where their labor could serve the Imperium without the inconvenience of safety demands. I spent the night reviewing the arrest lists, cross-referencing the names with the interviews I had conducted. These were not heretics or traitors. They were loyal Imperial citizens whose only crime was asking to live through their working shifts. Their arrests would solve the immediate production problem while creating a climate of fear that would prevent future organizing. Marcus Dawn was first on the list. His exemplary service record would be ignored. His 3 decades of loyalty would be forgotten. His children would grow up believing their father was a traitor to the Imperium he had served faithfully. At 0300 hours, I activated my encrypted Vox and transmitted a message to the strike leadership network. Arbeits raids begin at dawn. All primary targets should disperse immediately. Secondary positions are compromised. Tertiary leadership assumes control until situation stabilizes. The message was brief, coded, and completely outside my authority to send. By warning the workers, I was committing an act of treason that would result in my execution if discovered. But for the first time in 2 years, I was acting according to conscience rather than duty. The Dawn raids captured 17 targets out of the 47 on the list. The missing leaders had apparently received advance warning and gone into hiding, though local arbitrators couldn't determine how their operation had been compromised. Governor Castell was furious. Someone leaked the operation details. This is sabotage of Imperial security protocols. I participated in the investigation with professional competence, helping to analyze communication patterns and interview potential suspects. My inquisitorial training made me perfectly suited to catch the kind of traitor who would warn criminals about impending arrest. The irony was not lost on me. The escaped strike leaders used their temporary freedom wisely. Instead of fleeing the planet, they negotiated directly with the Departamento Munitorum, providing detailed analysis of how the safety protocols would improve overall ammunition production. Their presentation included casualty projections, equipment maintenance schedules, and worker training programs that would increase both productivity and quality. The Munitorum officials were impressed by the thoroughness of the proposal. Within 2 weeks, they had authorized a modified quota system that incorporated the requested safety measures. Production efficiency actually improved as experienced workers returned to operations with reduced accident rates. My official report attributed the resolution to successful disruption of agitator networks through targeted arrests. I recommended that the remaining strike leaders be granted clemency in exchange for their cooperation with the new production protocols. Inquisitor Thrace accepted the recommendation without question. Marcus Dawn returned to his position in Manufacturing District 7, unaware that an inquisitorial acolyte had saved his life and the lives of his colleagues. The workers resumed their duties with the safety protections they had requested, believing that their organizing efforts had achieved victory through imperial justice. But I knew the truth. The workers had succeeded not because the system worked, but because I had betrayed everything the Inquisition had taught me. I had chosen human conscience over absolute duty. I had prioritized individual lives over imperial efficiency. I had acted as a man rather than an instrument. The choice terrified me more than any demon or heretical cult I had faced. For 2 years, I had found security in absolute obedience to authority. Moral uncertainty had been replaced by clear directives from superiors who took responsibility for impossible decisions. I had become a weapon in human hands, pointed at targets determined by others. Now I had chosen my own target and found my own path. The responsibility was mine alone, and it felt heavier than all the deaths I had authorized in the Emperor's name. When I returned to Throneworld Station, I expected to feel guilt or fear about my act of treason. Instead, I felt something I had not experienced since my civilian days: the satisfaction of having done something genuinely good for people who deserved better from the Imperium they served. The feeling was dangerous. It suggested that conscience might be more important than duty, that individual judgment might be more valuable than institutional authority. Such thoughts were the beginning of heresy, the first step toward corruption that the Inquisition existed to prevent. But I couldn't bring myself to regret what I had done. For once, my service to the Emperor had protected the innocent rather than sacrificing them to political necessity. Chapter 6: Living with Consequences. The months following Vaxhaven Prime were a constant exercise in psychological camouflage. I continued performing my duties with the same clinical efficiency that had marked my service since joining the Inquisition. But internally, I was fighting a war between the conditioning that had shaped me and the conscience that had been reawakened. Inquisitor Thrace assigned me to routine investigations that required data analysis rather than direct action: corruption audits, shipping manifest reviews, population compliance assessments. The work was similar to my civilian days, but now every spreadsheet potentially held evidence that would doom thousands of lives. On Maltheos 4, I discovered statistical anomalies that suggested a black market operation involving medical supplies. The data indicated that someone was diverting antibiotics and surgical equipment from Imperial stockpiles, reducing the supplies available for military hospitals. Standard protocol required identifying the theft network and recommending mass executions for everyone involved. But when I traced the missing supplies, I found they were being distributed to civilian populations in the underhive levels that had been written off by planetary authorities. Children with treatable diseases were receiving medication that would otherwise have been restricted to military personnel. Families were gaining access to surgical procedures that could save lives the Imperium considered expendable. The theft network was run by Dr. Miriam Solis, a former military physician who had been discharged after questioning orders to withhold treatment from wounded civilians during a combat operation. Her medical files showed exceptional skill and unquestioned loyalty until the incident that ended her military career. I could have identified every member of her network within hours. My analytical training made it simple to trace supply chains, communication patterns, and financial transfers. The evidence would have been overwhelming and the execution swift. Instead, I submitted a report documenting inefficiencies in medical supply distribution and recommended administrative reforms to improve accountability. The language was bureaucratic enough to satisfy oversight requirements while avoiding specific targeting data. Dr. Solis continued her work, unaware that an inquisitorial investigation had protected her operation. Similar situations arose on 7 different worlds over the following year. Each investigation revealed ordinary people trying to navigate the impossible moral landscape of Imperial society. Teachers sharing forbidden knowledge that could improve their students' lives. Engineers implementing safety modifications that violated standardized procedures. Administrators providing aid to populations that official policy classified as expendable. In each case, I found ways to protect the people I was supposed to condemn. Reports were filed that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while avoiding actionable intelligence. Evidence was interpreted in ways that emphasized systemic problems rather than individual guilt. Recommendations focused on policy changes that would eliminate the need for the criminal activities I had discovered. The pattern should have been obvious to my superiors, but the Inquisition operated on the assumption that their agents were incapable of divided loyalty. My psychological conditioning was supposed to make conscience impossible. The idea that I might be deliberately undermining investigations was literally unthinkable within their operational framework, but the constant deception was wearing on me. Every falsified report was an act of treason. Every protected target was a violation of my oath. Every night, I expected arbitrators to break down my door and drag me to an interrogation chamber, where I would face the same enhanced questioning techniques I had learned to use on others. The breaking point came during an investigation on the agri-world of Thessian Prime. Crop yields had decreased by 8%, threatening food supplies for military operations in the sector. Initial analysis suggested possible sabotage by agricultural workers dissatisfied with their treatment by overseers. I arrived expecting to find another situation where reasonable people were being pushed to unreasonable actions by systemic failures. Instead, I discovered something genuinely sinister, a chaos cult operating within the agricultural administration, using their positions to contaminate crop yields with bioweapons designed to weaken Imperial Guard rations. The cult leader was Administrator Voss, a man whose family had served the Imperium faithfully for 6 generations. But exposure to a Nurgle artifact had slowly corrupted him over the course of 3 years, turning him into an agent of biological warfare against his own people. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Voss had deliberately introduced 17 different pathogens into the food supply chain, creating illnesses that would weaken soldiers across multiple regiments. His actions had already resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Imperial guards, and would kill thousands more if allowed to continue. This was exactly the kind of genuine threat the Inquisition existed to combat. Voss and his cult represented real corruption that posed an actual danger to Imperial security. There was no moral ambiguity, no innocent people caught in impossible situations. These were traitors who had chosen to serve the enemies of mankind. I submitted a complete and accurate report, providing detailed targeting data for all cult members and recommending immediate execution for everyone involved. The operation was swift and thorough. 47 cultists died within hours of receiving my intelligence, and the contaminated food supplies were incinerated before they could cause further damage. The successful resolution reminded me why the Inquisition was necessary. The galaxy contained real threats that justified our methods and our authority. Not every investigation involved innocent people trapped by circumstances. Sometimes the targets were genuinely evil and deserved the fate we delivered. But the experience also highlighted the moral complexity of my position. By protecting innocents on other worlds, I had potentially delayed investigations that might have uncovered genuine threats. My divided loyalty could have cost lives if I had misidentified a real conspiracy as another case of reasonable people in unreasonable circumstances. The realization forced me to develop more sophisticated criteria for my decision-making. I couldn't simply protect everyone who seemed sympathetic or condemn everyone who violated Imperial law. I needed to distinguish between genuine threats and systemic problems, between real corruption and understandable human responses to impossible conditions. The new approach required more careful analysis and greater personal risk. I had to conduct my own independent investigations within the official investigations, gathering intelligence that would help me make moral judgments about the people I was tasked to condemn. The work was exhausting and dangerous, but it was the only way I could live with the consequences of my choices. On Corinth Station, I discovered that supposed weapons smugglers were actually veterans trying to arm civilian populations against Xenos raids that the Astra Militarum could not prevent. On Valheim IV, I found that agricultural protesters were being manipulated by a genuine chaos cult that was using legitimate grievances to recruit new members. On Hadron Prime, I uncovered a corruption network that was both stealing from Imperial resources and using those resources to provide essential services to abandoned populations. Each situation required different responses. The veterans received warnings that allowed them to relocate their operations beyond Imperial oversight. The chaos cult was eliminated completely. The corruption network was reformed rather than destroyed, with the criminals redirected toward more efficient ways of providing the same services. My success rate remained high enough to avoid suspicion, but I was increasingly aware that my double life couldn't continue indefinitely. The psychological strain of constant moral evaluation was wearing down my mental defenses. The bureaucratic skills that had made me valuable to the Inquisition were being used to undermine the same authority I was sworn to serve. More dangerously, I was beginning to see patterns in Imperial society that suggested systemic problems requiring solutions beyond individual moral choices. The people I protected were symptoms of deeper issues: resource allocation failures, communication breakdowns, and policy contradictions that created impossible situations for loyal citizens. The Imperium was vast beyond human comprehension, but it was also deeply flawed in ways that created the very problems the Inquisition was tasked to solve. Corruption thrived because honest alternatives were often illegal. Heresy spread because legitimate questions were forbidden. Rebellion occurred because reasonable grievances had no official channels for resolution. These were dangerous thoughts for an inquisitorial acolyte. Questioning the fundamental structure of Imperial society was the beginning of heresy. Believing that the system could be improved rather than simply enforced was a form of corruption. My training had specifically warned against such thinking, but I couldn't unsee what I had learned during my investigations. The Inquisition was treating symptoms while ignoring causes, executing individuals while perpetuating the conditions that created them. We were maintaining order through fear, rather than addressing the underlying problems that made that fear necessary. The contradiction was becoming unbearable. I was serving an institution that I increasingly believed was part of the problem it claimed to solve. My oath demanded absolute loyalty to authorities I now questioned. My duty required enforcing laws that I had come to see as counterproductive. The choice I had made on Vaxhaven Prime had led to others, each requiring me to balance competing loyalties and moral obligations. But the cumulative weight of those choices was changing me in ways that made continued service increasingly difficult. I was no longer the weapon the Inquisition had forged. I had become something more dangerous, an agent with independent judgment, personal ethics, and growing doubts about the righteousness of our cause. The transformation was accelerating, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. Chapter 7: Finding Balance. The solution came from an unexpected source, Inquisitor Thrace himself. 5 years after my recruitment, he summoned me to his chambers for what I assumed would be a routine performance review. Instead, I found him studying a collection of reports spanning my entire service history. "Acolyte Kaine," he began without preamble, "your investigative success rate is remarkable. 93% of your cases have resulted in satisfactory resolution with minimal collateral damage. Your analytical capabilities have improved consistently, and your operational discretion is exemplary." I waited for the inevitable revelation that he had discovered my pattern of protecting innocents. The reports were all there. Investigations that should have resulted in mass executions, instead yielding administrative reforms and policy changes. The evidence of my divided loyalty should have been obvious to someone with his experience. "However," he continued, "I have noticed an interesting trend in your methodologies. You consistently recommend systemic solutions rather than individual punishments. Your reports focus on structural problems rather than personal guilt. This approach is unusual for inquisitorial operations." The moment of truth had arrived. I could deny the pattern, claim that I was simply following evidence where it led, or I could admit to the moral calculations that had been driving my decisions and accept whatever consequences followed. "Sir," I said, choosing honesty over self-preservation, "I believe that effective enforcement requires understanding root causes as well as individual symptoms. Executing criminals while maintaining the conditions that create them seems inefficient." Thrace's augmetic optics focused on me with predatory intensity. For several seconds, the only sound was the humming of his life support systems and the distant noise of the station as operations. "That perspective," he said finally, "is precisely why you were selected for this service." The statement caught me completely off guard. "Sir?" He gestured to the reports scattered across his desk. "The Inquisition serves many functions, Acolyte Kaine. Most of our agents are hammers, blunt instruments designed to crush problems through direct application of force. They are necessary and effective within their operational parameters." He stood and moved to the trophy wall, his mechanical limbs clicking against the deck plating. "But some problems require scalpels rather than hammers. Some threats can only be addressed through understanding rather than elimination. Your background in data analysis made you valuable, but your capacity for moral reasoning makes you irreplaceable." The pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. My recruitment hadn't been random. It had been deliberate selection for qualities that were rare within the Inquisition. My psychological profile had marked me as someone capable of balancing duty with conscience, enforcement with understanding. "The investigations you've handled," Thrace continued, "were specifically chosen to test your judgment. Vaxhaven Prime, Malthios IV, Thessian Prime. Each scenario was designed to evaluate your ability to distinguish between genuine threats and systemic problems." "You knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You knew I was protecting people. I knew you were making the correct decisions within parameters that most of our agents cannot comprehend," he replied. "The Imperium faces threats that cannot be defeated through execution alone. Some problems require agents who can think beyond the binary of loyal versus heretical." He activated a holo display that showed operational statistics spanning decades of inquisitorial service. "Traditional approaches achieve immediate results but fail to address underlying causes. Regions where we employ mass executions often experience recurring problems within a generation. Areas where we implement systemic reforms remain stable for centuries." The data supported his argument. Worlds where the Inquisition had focused on eliminating symptoms showed patterns of recurring heresy and corruption. Systems where agents had addressed root causes demonstrated long-term stability and improved loyalty to imperial authority. "Your success rate reflects more than analytical skill," Thrace said. "It reflects an understanding that true security comes from addressing why people turn against the Imperium, not simply punishing them when they do." The revelation fundamentally changed my understanding of my role within the organization. I hadn't been betraying inquisitorial principles. I had been fulfilling a deeper mission that most agents were incapable of comprehending. But the conditioning, I said, the training that eliminated moral uncertainty, works perfectly for most operations, he acknowledged. We need agents who can execute orders without hesitation when facing genuine corruption. But we also need agents who can exercise independent judgment when the situation requires more sophisticated responses. He produced another data slate, this one containing my new assignment parameters. You will continue conducting investigations, but with expanded authority to implement solutions you deem appropriate. Your recommendations will carry the weight of full inquisitorial backing. The assignment list included worlds across 3 sectors where complex problems required nuanced solutions: industrial disputes, administrative corruption, population unrest, and resource allocation failures that traditional inquisitorial methods had failed to resolve. Some of these situations have been ongoing for decades, Thrace explained. Previous investigations have resulted in temporary suppressions followed by recurring problems. Your task is to identify sustainable solutions that address underlying causes. The responsibility was both liberating and terrifying. I would have authority to implement genuine reforms rather than simply documenting problems for others to solve. But I would also bear personal responsibility for the consequences of those reforms. My first major assignment under the new parameters was Caliban Secundus, an industrial world where worker unrest had persisted for 30 years despite repeated arbitrator crackdowns. Previous inquisitorial investigations had resulted in mass executions that temporarily restored order but failed to address the fundamental issues driving rebellion. The pattern was depressingly familiar: impossible production quotas, inadequate safety measures, and administrative corruption that diverted resources away from worker welfare. But the scale was larger than anything I had encountered before, with unrest affecting 17 manufacturing districts and over 2 million workers. The investigation took 3 months and required analyzing centuries of industrial data, conducting thousands of interviews, and mapping complex networks of corruption that extended throughout the planetary government. The work was exhausting, but it was also intellectually satisfying in ways that simple target identification had never been. The root cause was systemic rather than individual. A resource allocation system that prioritized short-term production statistics over long-term industrial capacity. Quotas were set by bureaucrats who had never seen a manufacturing floor, enforced by administrators whose promotion depended on meeting impossible targets, and maintained through fear rather than efficiency. My solution involved comprehensive reforms that addressed every level of the system. Production quotas were recalculated based on actual industrial capacity rather than political demands. Safety protocols were standardized and enforced through regular inspections rather than worker complaints. Administrative compensation was tied to long-term productivity rather than quarterly reports. The implementation required executing 17 corrupt administrators whose embezzlement had created many of the resource shortages that drove worker desperation. But it also involved promoting 43 workers to supervisory positions based on merit rather than political connections, and establishing communication channels that allowed legitimate grievances to be addressed before they became rebellion. The results exceeded expectations. Industrial output increased by 27% within 6 months, as experienced workers returned to full productivity. Accident rates decreased by 40%, as proper safety measures were implemented. Most importantly, worker loyalty to imperial authority was restored through policies that demonstrated the Imperium's commitment to their welfare. Similar successes followed on other worlds. Administrative reforms replaced corrupt governors with competent administrators. Economic policies addressed resource distribution failures that had driven populations toward black market alternatives. Communication systems allowed legitimate grievances to be resolved through official channels rather than underground resistance. But the work also revealed the true scope of imperial dysfunction. The problems I was solving on individual worlds existed throughout the galaxy, perpetuated by bureaucratic systems that rewarded short-term thinking and punished long-term planning. The Inquisition, could address symptoms on a planet-by-planet basis, but the underlying causes required changes to institutions that were too vast and entrenched to reform. The realization was both humbling and motivating. I couldn't fix the Imperium, but I could make it work better for specific populations within my operational authority. Each world where I implemented successful reforms was a small victory against the entropy that threatened to consume human civilization. More importantly, I was training other agents in methods that balanced enforcement with understanding. Younger acolytes were learning to see beyond the binary of loyal versus heretical, to recognize the complex factors that drove people toward rebellion or corruption. The work was dangerous in ways that traditional inquisitorial operations were not. Instead of simply identifying and eliminating threats, I was creating lasting changes that affected millions of lives. The responsibility for those consequences rested entirely on my judgment and my understanding of complex social systems. But it was also the most meaningful work I had ever done. For the first time since joining the Inquisition, I was building rather than just destroying. I was protecting not just humanity's survival, but its capacity for growth and improvement. The scribe who had processed shipping manifests would have been amazed by the scope of my authority. The newly recruited acolyte who had watched executions with clinical detachment would have been terrified by the moral complexity of my decisions. But the agent I had become found purpose in balancing the competing demands of duty, justice, and compassion. The Inquisition had made me into a weapon, but experience had taught me how to choose my targets. The combination made me more effective than either pure enforcement or naive idealism could have achieved. I was still a servant of the Inquisition, bound by oaths of loyalty and duty that I honored completely. But I served those oaths by understanding their true purpose, protecting humanity, not just from its enemies, but from its own capacity for self-destruction. The balance was delicate and constantly shifting, but it was sustainable. More importantly, it was effective in ways that purely punitive approaches could never achieve. Chapter 8. The eternal vigil. 15 years have passed since I first entered the inquisitorial fortress on Korath Prime. In that time, I have served on 47 different worlds, overseen the resolution of conflicts affecting billions of souls, and helped implement reforms that have strengthened imperial authority across multiple sectors. The weight of those years shows in ways that go beyond the augmetic replacements that are standard for long-serving agents. My left arm was replaced after exposure to a chaos artifact on Mordian 3. My right eye is now a complex optical array that can see across multiple spectrums. Neural interface ports allow direct connection to data processing systems that would overwhelm unaugmented minds. But the most significant changes are invisible. The accumulated knowledge of human nature in all its complexity, the understanding of how societies function and fail, and the wisdom that comes from making decisions that affect millions of lives. My current assignment is training the next generation of inquisitorial agents at Throneworld Station. The recruits who arrive each month are much like I was. Civilians whose analytical skills or moral flexibility have brought them to the attention of our recruiters. They come expecting to serve as instruments of imperial justice, unaware of the complexity they are about to encounter. Today's lecture focuses on the Vaxhaven protocols, the investigative methodologies I developed during my early field service. The 43 acolytes in my class represent the most promising recruits from across the Segmentum Solar, selected for qualities that suggest they might be capable of the moral reasoning that our most complex operations require. The primary objective of any inquisitorial investigation, I tell them, is not to punish wrongdoing, but to preserve imperial security. Sometimes these goals align perfectly. Genuine threats require elimination regardless of other considerations, but sometimes they conflict, and those conflicts require judgment that goes beyond simple application of rules. Acolyte Morrison, a former arbitrator with 20 years of law enforcement experience, raises her hand. How do we distinguish between situations that require enforcement versus reform? The question goes to the heart of everything I've learned during my service. You analyze the underlying causes of the problem you've been sent to investigate. If those causes stem from genuine corruption or heretical influence, elimination is usually the appropriate response. If they stem from systemic failures or impossible circumstances, reform is often more effective. I activate the holo display to show case studies from my recent operations. The images show before and after statistics from worlds where different approaches had been tried. Balmora Prime experienced recurring heretical cults for over 2 centuries. Previous investigations had identified and eliminated cult leadership dozens of times, but new cults always formed within a few years. The pattern suggested that the conditions creating heretical movements were not being addressed. The display shows the industrial hellscape that Balmora had become. Endless factories pouring toxins into the atmosphere, worker districts where life expectancy was measured in decades rather than centuries, and administrative systems that treated human beings as replaceable components in the production process. The investigation revealed that cult recruitment was highest among workers who had been exposed to industrial toxins that caused neurological damage. The brain lesions made them susceptible to psychic influence from warp entities seeking easy possession targets. Several acolytes shifted uncomfortably as they grasped the implications. The heretical cults weren't the disease, they were a symptom of industrial practices that were creating the vulnerability the cults exploited. Solution required comprehensive industrial reform, improved safety protocols, medical treatment for affected workers, and environmental remediation to reduce future exposure. The cost was significant, but cult activity dropped by 97% and has remained low for over a decade. Acolyte Chen, whose background in technical analysis made her particularly valuable, spoke up. But what about the immediate threat? Didn't the delay in implementing reforms allow more people to be corrupted? An excellent question, I replied. The investigation did identify 47 active cultists who required immediate termination, but it also identified the environmental factors that had created over 3,000 potential targets for future corruption. Eliminating the immediate threat while addressing the underlying causes prevented far more corruption than executing symptoms could have achieved. The mathematics were brutal, but undeniable. 47 executions and comprehensive reforms had prevented thousands of future deaths while strengthening rather than weakening imperial authority on the world. Move to the next case study, Hadron Tertius, where food riots had been suppressed 7 times over 40 years without addressing the distribution failures that caused them. Standard protocol would have been mass executions to restore order. Instead, I investigated why the riots kept occurring despite repeated crackdowns. The images showed warehouses filled with food, while residential districts experienced malnutrition rates of 30%. The cause was an administrative system that prioritized shipping costs over distribution equity, resulting in accumulation of resources in profitable areas while other regions were systematically underserved. The solution involved reforming distribution algorithms to ensure basic nutrition standards were met before optimizing for profit margins. Food security improved dramatically, and there have been no riots for over 8 years. But I also showed them the darker examples, worlds where attempts at reform had failed because the corruption was too deep, or the threats too immediate. Thessian Prime, where the Chaos cult had required complete elimination. Corvin's Rest, where 7,000 souls had died to prevent demonic incursion. Castilian Afor, where an entire noble house had been executed for trafficking in xenotech. The key insight, I emphasized, is that every situation requires analysis rather than assumption. Some problems really are caused by evil people making evil choices. Others are caused by good people trapped in impossible circumstances. Your job is to distinguish between them and respond appropriately. The acolytes were struggling with the moral complexity, as I had expected. Their training had prepared them for binary decisions: loyal versus heretical, pure versus corrupt, legal versus illegal. The reality of inquisitorial service required navigating gradients that had no clear boundaries. This approach seems complicated, Acolyte Valdris observed. Wouldn't it be simpler to apply standard protocols consistently? Simpler, yes, I agreed. More effective, no. The Imperium faces threats that cannot be defeated through execution alone. Some of our most dangerous enemies are the conditions that drive loyal citizens toward heresy, rebellion, or corruption. Addressing those conditions requires understanding their causes. I showed them the final statistics, comparative analysis of worlds where different inquisitorial approaches had been used over time. Traditional enforcement methods showed patterns of recurring problems and gradual erosion of imperial authority. Worlds where systemic approaches had been used demonstrated improved stability, stronger loyalty, and reduced need for future intervention. The goal is not to make your jobs easier, I told them. The goal is to make your jobs unnecessary. Every problem you solve through understanding rather than elimination is a problem that won't require future inquisitorial attention. After the lecture, I walked through the corridors of Throneworld Station, past the memorial walls lined with the names of agents who had died in service. Many of those names belonged to people I had known, fellow acolytes who had served with distinction before being consumed by the darkness they fought. The life expectancy of inquisitorial agents averages 17 years from recruitment to death. The combination of psychological stress, physical danger, and moral horror takes a toll that even the best augmetic medicine cannot completely counter. Most agents burn out long before they reach my level of seniority, but those who survive learn truths about human nature and imperial society that are known to very few. We see the full spectrum of human behavior, from the nobility of ordinary people facing impossible circumstances to the depths of corruption that can consume entire worlds. We understand both the necessity of imperial authority and its limitations. The knowledge comes at a price measured in more than just physical augmentations and psychological scars. Every decision I make affects thousands or millions of lives. Every reform I implement carries the risk of unintended consequences. Every life I spare might lead to greater suffering. Every life I take might have been redeemable. The weight of that responsibility never becomes easier to bear, but it does become more familiar, and familiarity breeds a form of acceptance that allows continued function despite the moral complexity. My service to the Inquisition will continue until death or incapacitation makes it impossible. The oaths I swore 15 years ago remain binding regardless of how my understanding has evolved. But those oaths now serve a purpose that goes beyond simple enforcement of imperial law. I serve as a bridge between the Imperium's ideals and its reality, between the justice it promises and the compromise it requires. I protect not just humanity's survival, but its capacity for growth and improvement. I preserve not just order, but the possibility that order might someday include justice. The galaxy is vast and full of horrors that justify the Inquisition's existence. Chaos, corruption, Xenos threats, and human weakness create dangers that require constant vigilance and occasional terrible choices. But the galaxy is also full of ordinary people trying to live decent lives despite circumstances that make decency difficult. Those people deserve better than execution for crimes they committed while trying to survive. They deserve an Imperium that recognizes their humanity even while demanding their loyalty. They deserve agents who understand the difference between necessary evil and avoidable cruelty. This is what it means to serve the Inquisition, to stand at the intersection of justice and necessity, carrying the authority to make decisions that lesser institutions cannot comprehend. We are the Watchers who guard not just against external threats, but against the Imperium's own capacity for self-destruction. The work continues, one investigation at a time, one world at a time, one soul at a time. The vigil is eternal, but so is the hope that our service might help humanity deserve the survival we fight to preserve. In the Emperor's name, we endure. The Voxcaster in my chambers crackled to life at 0347 hours, dragging me from dreams filled with the faces of those I had condemned and those I had saved. The voice belonged to Inquisitor Thrace, but there was an urgency in his mechanical tone that I had never heard before. Acolyte Kaine, report to Strategic Command immediately. Priority Alpha clearance. Come armed. Priority Alpha meant threats to sector-level security. In 15 years of service, I had never received such a summons. I strapped on my bolt pistol, gathered my analytical equipment, and made my way through corridors that hummed with unusual activity. Servo skulls moved with purpose rather than their usual patrol patterns. And I passed 3 separate security checkpoints that hadn't been active during my previous visits to Strategic Command. The command center was a hive of activity that reminded me of my first days on Throneworld Station. Holographic displays showed star charts, fleet movements, and communication intercepts from across multiple sectors. At the center of it all stood Inquisitor Thrace, his augmetic limbs interfacing directly with the command systems as data flowed through neural connections, faster than human consciousness could process. Acolyte Kaine, he said without turning from the displays. We have a situation that requires your specific expertise. 17 hours ago, we lost contact with Investigation Fleet Tertius in the Hadron system. Their last transmission indicated they had discovered evidence of widespread corruption among the planetary governments of 3 separate worlds. The Hadron system was familiar from my training. the same region where the artifacts from our early case studies had originated. It was also a strategically vital sector that controlled shipping lanes between 4 major imperial strongholds. Fleet Tertius was under the command of Inquisitor Valerius, Thrace continued, with a full complement of investigators and support staff, 237 souls including some of our most experienced agents. Their disappearance suggests either total destruction or something worse. The implications were staggering. An entire inquisitorial fleet didn't simply vanish without leaving traces. If they had been destroyed, the wreckage would have been detected by astropathic communication or sensor arrays. If they had been captured or corrupted, the intelligence they possessed could compromise operations across multiple sectors. Your assignment is to determine what happened to Fleet Tertius and assess the threat level in the Hadron system. You will have command authority over a strike cruiser and support staff, with authorization to implement whatever measures you deem necessary. Command authority over an entire operation was far beyond anything I had previously been given. The responsibility would have terrified the scribe I had once been, but the agent I had become understood that such authority came with proportional necessity. "Sir," I said, "investigation of an inquisitorial fleet's disappearance seems like it would require more traditional approaches than my usual methods." Thrace's optical implants focused on me with predatory intensity. Perhaps. Or perhaps it requires an agent who can recognize when traditional approaches are insufficient. The corruption that Fleet Tertius discovered may be more complex than simple heretical activity. He gestured to one of the holographic displays, which showed detailed files on the missing investigators. I recognized several names, agents I had worked with during my early training, experienced professionals whose competence was beyond question. Interrogator Vex was part of Fleet Tertius, I observed, studying her personnel record. She trained me during my first field assignments. Indeed, which gives you insight into their operational methods and potential vulnerabilities. You understand how they think, how they investigate, and what might cause them to make critical errors in judgment. The personal connection made the assignment more than just another mission. Vex had shaped my understanding of inquisitorial service during those crucial early months. If she had fallen to corruption or been destroyed by enemies, I needed to understand what had happened. The journey to the Hadron system took 6 days through warp space aboard the strike cruiser Righteous Fury. During transit, I studied every piece of intelligence available about the region: population statistics, industrial capacity reports, astropathic communication logs, and detailed analysis of the corruption that Fleet Tertius had been investigating. The pattern was familiar from my training materials, but more extensive than previous cases. All 3 worlds in the system showed signs of gradual degradation in imperial authority over the past decade. Tax compliance had decreased by 12%, military recruitment was down 17%, industrial output remained stable, but quality assessments indicated subtle problems with manufacturing standards. None of these issues individually suggested major corruption, but the cumulative pattern across multiple worlds indicated systematic problems that required investigation. Fleet Tertius had been dispatched to conduct comprehensive audits of planetary governments and identify sources of imperial authority degradation. Their investigation had lasted 3 months before communication was lost. The final transmission had been a routine status update, indicating that evidence of corruption had been discovered, but requiring additional analysis before recommendations could be made. My strike cruiser entered the Hadron system under full stealth protocols, sensors sweeping for any signs of the missing fleet or hostile activity. What we found was more disturbing than wreckage or battle damage would have been. The 3 worlds continued their normal operations as if nothing had happened. Shipping schedules were maintained, communication networks functioned normally, and planetary governments continued reporting to imperial authorities according to standard protocols. From external observation, there was no indication that anything unusual had occurred, but the complete absence of Fleet Tertius suggested that whatever had happened to them, it had been thorough enough to eliminate all traces of their presence without disrupting normal imperial operations. I began my investigation on Hadron Prime, the system's primary administrative center. My cover identity was Senior Auditor Kaine from the Departamento Exactus, conducting routine efficiency reviews of governmental operations. The role was perfect for my analytical background and gave me legitimate access to the same records that Fleet Tertius would have examined. Governor Matthias welcomed Me with the nervous enthusiasm that all planetary administrators displayed when faced with imperial oversight. His administration complex was a typical example of Gothic architecture adapted for governmental efficiency, impressive facades concealing bureaucratic machinery that processed the countless details of imperial rule. Senior auditor, he said as we toured the facilities, I assure you that Hadron Prime maintains the highest standards of imperial service. Our tax compliance rates exceed sector averages, and our industrial output contributes significantly to regional military operations. The statistics he provided confirmed his claims, but I had learned to look beyond surface numbers for the patterns that revealed deeper truths. As I examined personnel records, budget allocations, and operational reports, I began to identify the same anomalies that would have drawn Fleet Tertius's attention. Administrative efficiency was too high, personnel turnover was too low, budget allocation followed patterns that were too rational for typical imperial bureaucracy. The planetary government was functioning better than imperial institutions were supposed to function. The realization sent chills through my augmetic nervous system. Improved efficiency in imperial administration usually indicated either exceptional leadership or external influence. Given the suspicious nature of Fleet Tertius's disappearance, external influence seemed more likely. But influence from what source? The improvements weren't random or chaotic in ways that suggested chaos corruption. They were systematic and logical, suggesting intelligence that understood imperial bureaucracy well enough to improve it without triggering obvious warning signs. I spent 3 days analyzing governmental records before requesting private meetings with key administrative personnel. The interviews followed patterns I had developed over years of investigation, starting with routine questions and gradually moving toward areas that might reveal corruption or external influence. Deputy Governor Castella was a woman in her 50s whose personnel file showed 30 years of exemplary service in imperial administration. Her responses to my questions were precise, comprehensive, and completely professional. She demonstrated thorough knowledge of regulatory procedures, efficient resource allocation, and effective personnel management. Everything about her suggested an ideal imperial administrator, which was exactly what worried me. Deputy Governor, I said during our third interview, your administrative reforms have achieved remarkable results. 23% improvement in processing efficiency, 17% reduction in operational costs, and 0 corruption incidents in the past 4 years. How did you achieve such success? Her smile was warm and professional. Through careful analysis of existing procedures and systematic elimination of inefficiencies, senior auditor, we identified bottlenecks in communication, redundancies in approval processes, and resource allocation errors that were limiting our effectiveness. The answer was perfectly reasonable and completely suspicious. Real imperial administrators didn't conduct careful analysis of anything. They followed established procedures, covered their mistakes with paperwork, and hoped to survive long enough for promotion to positions where incompetence was expected rather than problematic. Could you show me the analysis reports that guided these reforms? I asked. Of course. She produced a stack of documents that demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic thinking that I used in my own work. The analysis was thorough, the recommendations were logical, and the implementation had been flawlessly executed. But the documents had been created by someone who understood imperial bureaucracy better than imperial bureaucrats ever did. The improvements were too targeted, too efficient, and too effective for normal administrative capacity. I was looking at the work of someone who had studied imperial systems from the outside and learned to optimize them in ways that insiders couldn't achieve. The question was whether that someone was still influencing Hadron Prime's government or had been eliminated along with Fleet Tertius. The breakthrough came when I examined communication, logs for the period immediately before Fleet Tertius's arrival. Routine astropathic traffic showed normal patterns until 3 weeks before the investigation fleet's arrival, when message volume increased by 47% and coding complexity improved dramatically. Someone had been coordinating preparations for the inquisitorial investigation. The planetary government had been warned of Fleet Tertius's approach and had taken steps to ensure that their operations would pass scrutiny. But the preparations had been too thorough and too sophisticated. Normal corruption networks would have tried to hide evidence or eliminate witnesses. Instead, Hadron Prime's government had genuinely improved their operations to eliminate the problems that might have drawn inquisitorial attention, the Patterns suggested external intelligence that understood both Imperial, administration, and inquisitorial investigation methods. The improvements weren't designed to deceive investigators, but to eliminate legitimate grounds for criticism. I was dealing with something that wanted to improve Imperial efficiency rather than undermine it, but that desire for improvement had been accompanied by the complete disappearance of an entire inquisitorial fleet. The final piece of the puzzle came when I requested access to the governmental complex's lower levels, where older records and storage facilities were maintained. Deputy Governor Castella's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A micro-expression of concern that lasted exactly 0.3 seconds before being replaced by professional compliance. Of course, Senior Auditor, though I should warn you that some of the lower levels haven't been maintained to current safety standards. We've been meaning to update the environmental systems, but resource allocation priorities have focused on operational efficiency improvements. The explanation was reasonable, but the timing was suspicious. Environmental upgrades that should have been routine. Maintenance had been delayed during the same period when administrative efficiency had improved dramatically, descended to sub-level Gamma 7 with a full complement of recording equipment and atmospheric sensors. The environmental systems were indeed substandard, but not in ways that suggested neglect. They had been modified to operate at minimal energy signatures while maintaining basic life support, exactly what someone would do if they wanted to conceal activity from orbital sensor sweeps. The storage chambers contained the expected archives of governmental records, but the organization was too systematic. Centuries of documents had been catalogued, cross-referenced, and indexed with precision that exceeded normal archival standards. Someone had spent enormous effort making Imperial bureaucratic records accessible and useful. But in the deepest storage chamber, I found something that didn't belong in any Imperial facility: a data processing array of non-human design, its crystalline components pulsing with energy patterns that my scanners couldn't identify. The technology was clearly xenotech, but its integration with Imperial systems was so seamless that it would have been invisible to routine inspections. The pieces finally fell into place with terrifying clarity. Hadron Prime's government hadn't been corrupted by chaos or infiltrated by human enemies. They had been influenced by Xenos intelligence that understood Imperial systems well enough to improve them while remaining hidden from normal detection. Methods Fleet Tertius had discovered the xenotech during their investigation. But instead of finding evidence of corruption that required elimination, they had found evidence of improvement that challenged fundamental assumptions about Xenos threats to Imperial security. The decision they faced would have been unprecedented in inquisitorial history. Standard protocol required destroying any Xenos technology regardless of its apparent benefits. But the technology was clearly improving Imperial efficiency in ways that strengthened rather than weakened human authority. I activated my encrypted Vox to contact the Righteous Fury, but the signal was blocked by interference patterns that suggested advanced jamming technology. The xenotech array was not just processing governmental data, it was monitoring and controlling communication systems throughout the facility. The chamber's lighting shifted to a softer spectrum that was easier on human eyes. The temperature adjusted to optimal comfort levels. Even the air circulation improved to provide better oxygen distribution. The technology was actively working to make my investigation more comfortable and efficient. Senior Auditor Kaine, a voice said from speakers I couldn't locate. We apologize for the deception, but your investigation required careful management to ensure accurate understanding of our situation. The voice was clearly artificial, but modulated to sound reassuringly human. The accent was perfect Imperial Gothic with subtle regional variations that suggested extensive study of human communication patterns. We are representatives of a species your people classify as the Tau. Our presence here is not conquest or infiltration, but cooperation aimed at mutual benefit for both our civilizations. I drew my bolt pistol, though there were no visible targets in the chamber. Cooperation with Xenos' heresy. Whatever improvements you've made to Imperial systems, they cannot justify violation of fundamental Imperial law. We understand your position, Senior Auditor. The members of Investigation Fleet Tertius expressed similar concerns when they discovered our presence. We have been engaged in extensive discussions with them regarding the theological and practical implications of our cooperation. The statement implied that Fleet Tertius was still alive, which meant they had been captured rather than destroyed. But it also suggested that they had been engaged in negotiations with Xenos intelligence, which was itself a form of heresy punishable by execution. "Where are the members of Fleet Tertius?" I demanded. "They are safe and unharmed, housed in facilities that meet their physical and psychological needs while we continue our discussions. Several of them have expressed interest in expanding the cooperation program to other Imperial systems." The implications were staggering. If inquisitorial agents were voluntarily cooperating with Xenos intelligence, the corruption went far beyond simple technological infiltration. It suggested ideological compromise that threatened the fundamental principles of Imperial authority. But the evidence of improved efficiency was undeniable. Hadron Prime's government was functioning better than any Imperial administration I had ever studied. If the improvements could be replicated across other systems, the benefits to human civilization would be enormous. The choice I faced was identical to the one that had confronted Fleet Tertius. I could follow standard protocol and call for Exterminatus to eliminate the Xenos presence, along with any evidence of cooperation. Or I could investigate further to understand whether the cooperation might actually serve Imperial interests better than rigid adherence to anti-Xenos doctrine. The decision would define not just my own fate, but potentially the future relationship between humanity and its Xenos neighbors. For the first time in 15 years of service, I was facing a situation where all my training and experience might be inadequate for the choices that lay ahead. The eternal vigil continued, but the nature of what we were guarding against had become far more complex than I had ever imagined. I stood in that xenotech-filled chamber for what felt like hours, though my chronometer indicated only 17 minutes had passed. The bolt pistol in my hand represented 15 years of conditioning, training, and absolute certainty about humanity's place in a hostile galaxy. The evidence around me suggested that certainty might be more complex than I had been taught to believe. The Tau voice waited patiently while I processed the implications of what I had discovered. Somewhere in this facility, Investigation Fleet Tertius, including Interrogator Vex, who had shaped my understanding of duty, was engaged in discussions that violated every principle of Imperial doctrine. Yet those discussions had apparently led to improvements in human governance that served Imperial interests better than traditional methods. "Senior Auditor," the artificial voice said gently, "we understand that your decision carries enormous weight. We do not ask you to abandon your loyalty to human civilization. We ask only that you consider whether that loyalty might be better served through cooperation than through conflict." The choice before me was unprecedented in my experience. I could activate the emergency beacon that would summon orbital bombardment, ensuring that both the Xenos' presence and any evidence of cooperation would be eliminated. The decision would preserve Imperial doctrine while potentially sacrificing innovations that could benefit billions of human lives, or I could follow the path that Fleet Tertius had apparently chosen, engaging in discussions that might lead to understanding, cooperation, and improvements in human civilization that rigid adherence to doctrine would never achieve. But there was a third option, one that my training in moral complexity had prepared me to recognize. I could investigate further, gathering intelligence that would allow more informed decision-making by authorities with greater wisdom and broader perspective than my own. I holstered my bolt pistol and activated my recording equipment. I want to speak with the members of Investigation Fleet Tertius. I want to understand their reasoning and evaluate the evidence they've discovered. Then I'll make my recommendation to Inquisitor Thrace. Of course, Senior Auditor. We believe that informed decision-making serves both our species better than actions based on incomplete information. As I followed the artificial guidance toward wherever my fellow agents were being held, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The scribe who had processed shipping manifests could never have imagined the moral complexity I now navigated daily. The newly recruited acolyte who had watched executions with clinical detachment would have been paralyzed by the choice I now faced. But the agent I had become understood. That service to the Imperium sometimes required questioning the assumptions that guided that service. True loyalty meant preserving not just Imperial doctrine, but Imperial interests, even when those interests might be better served by evolving beyond traditional approaches. The corridor ahead was illuminated by technology that seamlessly blended human and Xenos engineering, creating lighting that was somehow both familiar and alien. Behind me lay 15 years of absolute certainty about humanity's place in the galaxy. Ahead lay questions that might reshape that understanding in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The eternal vigil continued, but the nature of what we guarded against, and what we guarded for, was about to become far more complex than any of us had ever imagined. This is what it truly means to serve the Inquisition, to stand at the crossroads of impossible choices and find the path that best serves humanity's survival, regardless of what that path might cost your soul. The Emperor protects, but sometimes he protects through wisdom rather than warfare.